Everybody. While we allow people to connect, uh, this is just an image of somebody who's just died. Has nothing to do with the IDC, but it has lots of things in common with Latin America and some European countries mainly. Diego Maradona. This is our humble way of in memoriam of Diego, somebody who has had magical moments, but also some other issues really with his life. But anyway, so while we wait, we already have 26 connections. We're giving start to our activity today. As you all know, today we have Joshua Wright. Joshua will be presented formally afterwards by Nicolas. We will be co-moderating this with Nicolas Levin and Juan David Gutierrez from Chile and Colombia, respectively. It is also a pleasure to have Joshua here. Honestly, I didn't manage to read the 1,361 pages, but I managed to read some of the chapters, so I think it's enough at least to start and to listen to your presentation. More than 37 chapters, I think, for various backgrounds and I don't know, practitioners, academics, etc., etc. So before we get to Joshua, the same thing we always say or we always mention about the IDC. The IDC intends to be an independent space in which we can discuss issues related with competition law and policy. As I said, we want to stress our independence in that sense, and in this issue, actually, I think is an example of that independence in the sense of we're trying to listen to all the views on this issue, for example, and all the issues related with competition law and policy. As you all know, I think we already had all the opinions and all the visions on this issue. And in that sense, I think this virtual space and not physical space also helps us to have all the voices at the IDC. We do also have chapters from other Latin American countries such as Chile, Peru, Mexico, or Argentina, obviously, soon Colombia, etc. So the idea is to be have a regional view in Latin America mainly, but we're also obviously listening to all the views worldwide or globally. We also have an international advisory board that is, people such as Richard Wish, Ian Forrest, Barry Hawk, Larry Sorkin, Mark Patterson, Simon Holmes. I mean, we have a variety of academics, judges, practitioners taking part of our international advisory board, which I think it also equalizes our opinions and all we do. So said that, with no further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Nicolas. But before that, I'm going to use this image of Simonetta Vezzoso on all the reports that have been going on the subject matter of today, this digital competition. And I think if you see up there on the right, I think it's the last report, the Global Antitrust Institute's report on digital economy. So Joshua, again, thanks very much for joining the IDC. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we are really eager to listen to your presentation. So Nicolas, go ahead.
Thanks, Pablo. Welcome, everyone. We don't want to enter the discussion going into the chat from people from England saying that it was a hand. It was the hand of God. That's what the Argentinian side will say. So, well, going to our activity today, we have Professor Joshua Wright, the Executive Director of the Global Antitrust Institute, for presenting the report on digital economy. This report that includes 37 articles on it. It's a very extensive one. And I want to, well, Professor Wright is Professor and Executive Director of the Global Antitrust Institute at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University, and holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Economics. And he was appointed in 2013 by the US Senate, anonymously confirmed him as a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. and following his nomination by President Obama to that position. Then afterwards, in the fall of 2015, he rejoined the Scalia Law School. So it's a very extensive bio. We want time for discussion here. So welcome everybody, and please, Professor Wright, go ahead. Then we will have Juan David Gutierrez having some questions. He will be moderating that part. So please, Joshua, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas, and Pablo for having me, and to the IDC. I'm grateful for the opportunity and to share some of GAI's work with you, and to talk about the report. I thought that what I would do, it is impossible to cover 1,300 pages sort of as an intro. So I thought what I would do that would be most useful, and the most fun thing for me is to engage in discussion with you all as well. So I thought what I would do is sort of do a short walkthrough of the way we see the report and where it fits, talk about maybe a couple of the chapters in brief overview, and sort of do most of it in discussion. So I've got some slides I will share with you, and hopefully you can see them. Yeah. Okay. So Pablo put up that beautiful slide. I wish I had it. I may ask you for a copy with all of the reports that have come out. It has been report season in competition policy around the world, and certainly in the United States. There are sort of no shortage of reports, and so I do want to get to the question of why another one, which we will get to. But even sort of focusing on a handful and not even the full 20 or 30 that made Pablo's slide, a number of influential reports, and the reports vary in method, they vary in approach, they vary a little bit in policy prescription, but sort of I think it is fair to say that a unifying theme of those reports, though not completely uniform, is the idea that existing tools sort of aren't up to the task in digital markets, and we should be doing something different. And the something varies in important ways. And indeed, if you go through our 1,300 pages, there are a lot of suggestions to do something different as well. So maybe we too are unified in theme. Though perhaps the devil's in the details, as they say, on what the policy prescriptions are. So what else could possibly be said on the issues? We think there's a little bit more to do, and we certainly are hoping that we are contributing to the marketplace for ideas, and this is certainly during my lifetime, I think the most important, at least most vigorous debate that I've seen in and around antitrust issues. Certainly in the sense that everything is up for grabs, from the consumer welfare standard to the design of institutional issues, to how we craft sort of ex-ante versus ex-post approaches to antitrust, to the shape of the ex-post rules themselves, safe harbors and exemptions, sort of all of it up for grabs, which makes it an interesting and exciting time. And we thought that we had something sort of unique to offer. The GAI team, and I've got everyone on there. The GAI team is a mix of Judge Ginsburg, of course, who ran the DOJ's antitrust division before landing on the DC Circuit. Chief economist, Tad was a bureau director at the Federal Trade Commission, also was in-house at Coca-Cola for a long time, and then in private practice. Point being, a team that has, we've brought cases, we've been inside the agencies. Each of us has spent a significant time in the agencies or the courts, as well as sort of in academia or in private practice. And we'd like to think that we bring that approach. I don't know if balanced is the right word, but an approach where we've been both inside and outside the agencies and academia and private practice. We try to bring all of those sort of things to bear. And when I looked out in the world of the reports, and you know, I should say, like Pablo did with respect to the disclaimer for IDC, I guess I should say, anytime I've got a report with 50 authors on it, I'm speaking for myself here, and, you know, don't hold anything I say against my co-authors. You can hold it all against me is fair enough. My own view looking out into the reports was sort of a couple of observations. One, so it felt like the theory to data ratio was really high. I think it was, you know, and that might be a, you know, overbroad generalization to describe 30 reports, but in the interest of time, that's sort of my general view was a very high theory to data ratio. And, you know, one that I think left an opening for more empirical and sort of database discussion of some of the specific proposals at issue and some of the specific economic issues in play. And I think it is also fair to say, if you read the existing set of reports, that there are singing from the same playbook in the songbook, and the idea that the recommendations are almost always and everywhere for more, whether it is more antitrust, more budget, more regulation. And I think if you read our report, that is not, I think, the general thrust of our report. I think it is certainly differentiated on that front, although there are places where we call for more regulation or more antitrust activity as well. So our view is there was room for a different view, and I'd like to think that the report offers that. I should say, just to emphasize again, you know, I've got 50 authors. Some of them I know expressly disagree with some of the chapters in the book. The idea of the project was not to have a sort of monolithic GAI view of the world. We're just 5 people, and there's 1,300 pages. I promise you, none of us are that prolific. We relied heavily on invitations to academics, practitioners around the world to contribute to the project, and I'll sort of throw them all up at the screen at some point. But you have that many cooks in the kitchen, no one agrees entirely on how all the dishes are put together. But I think that is a feature and not a bug of the project. The idea of the project was to invite a diversity of views and sort of put them together in one place for our readers, and I hope we've accomplished that. You can get the report in a couple of places. You can click on those things and it'll take you right there. We've got a nice website set up where you can read and download from the page that we worked hard on putting together. We've also got an SSRN series for those of you who prefer downloading from SSRN. I'm paid by the download, so please use the SSRN links. That's how I make my dinner. So you can get the report from either of those places. I thought what I'd do is do a quick walkthrough, just sort of hit some highlights, and then we can just sort of talk. But the structure of the report is meant to be, it's really 3 different things. The part 1 is what we call our foundation section, but it's a series of primers, you know, meant to introduce to the topic in a lot of the areas in the law and economics of digital markets. A lot of this scholarship was produced around the time DOJ sued Microsoft, right? I mean, a lot of the economics literature was late 90s, early 2000s. And some of the seminal pieces to cite, some of the seminal pieces I cite are sort of from that era. And so what we did in the primer section is, I think we've all seen the antitrust and competition policy debates are broadened. They're sort of outside of just the domain of antitrust experts these days. And so we wanted to put together a series of useful primers for people who either needed a refresher on an issue or one needed to learn it for the first time. So we've got a series of primers. The second is meant to be sort of an empirical, truly a report section. It is, you know, a series of economic or empirical analyses or descriptive analyses of sort of what's going on in digital markets as an economic matter, or performance of antitrust institutions in those markets, but it's sort of meant to be the empirical core of the report. And the third section is policies and proposals. It's sort of getting to the nitty-gritty of discussing and analyzing some, we can't possibly do all, of the policies and proposals that are sort of around digital markets and offering some of our own as well. So for example, our foundation section has, I won't read all the authors, but hopefully some that you recognize, doing everything from sort of primers on IP and antitrust to the error cost framework to licensing to vertical restraints, sort of all around. A sampling of chapters that sort of live in the primer section. Elise Dorsey, who's advisor to Making Delrahim at the DOJ, has a chapter sort of providing a perspective on the debates over the consumer welfare standard, both in the US and abroad. My colleague at Scalia Law, John Yoon, who's sort of in GAI, has a primer chapter on vertical integration and vertical mergers in digital markets, a sort of hot topic in the US with the new vertical merger guidelines. Michael Salinger, economist at Boston University and former chief economist at the FTC, has a primer chapter sort of conceptually addressing self-preferencing issues, another sort of hot topic in policy debates, but we felt like the report readers would be better off having a sort of framework chapter before we discuss it again in the policy section in part 3. The empirical section, grateful to each of the authors who contributed, but again, this is our attempt to inject some data and evidence, or some more data and evidence into the policy discussions. So sample chapters in that area. John Click, who is an economist who teaches at the law school at the University of Pennsylvania, offers an empirical econometric perspective on the data on concentration and market performance that we've all seen, with markups and industrial concentration indicia sort of rising, and takes a critical look at that evidence and some of the inferences that have been drawn from it for policy conversations. One of my favorite chapters in the report is from Avinash Kohli's. One of the things we tried to do in the report was get some authors involved who are not, I don't know what the right word is, the usual suspects in the antitrust world. We all see a lot of work from the same authors, and Avinash was a young MIT graduate student, now a professor at Stanford, who had worked on papers trying to estimate the amount of consumer surplus arising in digital markets. And it's a sort of nice look at an economic frame for thinking about welfare gains and consumer surplus gains in those markets in particular, with important antitrust implications, though the chapter largely an empirical one, looking at the performance of those markets. Also in that section, my friend Tom Lambert, who is professor at the University of Missouri, looking at rent-seeking and public choice phenomena in digital markets and at enforcement agencies. Finally, policies and proposals, the section of the report that I suspect will get the most attention for one reason or another, are a series of chapters targeting sort of specific policy proposals, everything from content moderation on online platforms to sort of broader questions of ex-ante and ex-post regulation. Neil Chilson has a chapter on, there's a big proposals getting a lot of attention in the US about the creation of a new digital regulator, either in addition to or instead of our current regulatory framework. Telecom-oriented chapters of sort of 5G and the intersection of telecom and antitrust. My colleague James Cooper, who recently returned from Scalia from the FTC, has some work on the intersection of privacy and competition there. So lots of great chapters. Dan Crane on some of the proposals for institutional reform of the U.S. agencies. Lots of great stuff. My chapter with Bruce Kobayashi is we've worked a lot on this question of ex-ante versus ex-post regulation. So it is one of my own contributions in the book that I'm especially fond of. Former FTC chair Maureen Olhausen, now at Baker Botts, sort of extended some of her work and analysis that she took when she was at the Federal Trade Commission on occupational licensure, with some analysis and proposals for how to shape antitrust enforcement in digital markets, in particular with respect to occupational licensure and public restraints. And a couple of former chief economists at agencies in the US, the FTC for Mike Bay, who's done quite a bit of work on digital goods and digital markets, in particular pricing strategies, and Jeff Prince, who just returned from a chief economist stint at the FCC, with what I think is, if you're going to read one chapter, this is the one I would sort of, especially if you are a more lawyer than economist, this is the one I'd point you to. It's sort of written to be, just like the title says, sort of a user-friendly guide to the economics of digital platforms. And for those of you who do not know Mike Bay, great speaker, but also a writing style for someone who is as bright as he is and publishes in sort of high-minded theory journals and economics. One of the more talented economists I know that is able to sort of explain and write economics well for lawyers and regulators, which is an important task. So that's a sort of quick drive-by what we are trying to do in the approach that I think we took and what we think we have to offer here. We're obviously really proud of our work product and being able to get sort of all of these people together for to get this done. Our goal was to have it done before the election in the US in November, and we made it. We barely made it, but we made it. And in part, not to do anything particularly with the election, but because these debates and policy choices are coming now, and we wanted to sort of make our entry into the marketplace for ideas sooner rather than later. So I'm grateful to all of the co-authors and GII and otherwise that we're able to contribute, and grateful for the chance to come here and talk to you about it. So I will get out of the sharing here so I can see all of you, and am happy to talk about the report, anything. So I will leave it to you.
Thanks, Joshua. Well, we had a commentator first that has some problems. He was the superintendent of the Brazilian authority, but there have been a downgrade. I'm not sure if I was able to say that, but he was having some problems to join us at this hour. But now, Juan David, if you can go ahead, you have some questions, so the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nicolas, and thank you, Pablo, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to be part of a place where we can hear diverse opinions. As Pablo mentioned, we've heard since October Tommaso Valete, Nicolas Petit, and Philip Marsden, and now we have the pleasure of listening to Joshua's drive-by of the over 1,000-page report with 37 authors and 34 chapters, who, as Joshua said, come from different universities, from law firms, from economic consulting firms. There's retired DOJ lawyers. Well, the co-editor of the whole report is a current judge, Judge Ginsburg. And there's also people from think tanks. Well, of course, the report is as the introduction states a collection of views, and Joshua confirms this. I think my first questions to Joshua are more of the editorial type of questions before I get into the substance. I was wondering, why did the editors decide to go to select a collective work rather than the sort of reports that we've seen before? I think, of course, that's something that distinguishes the report from previous report, but I'm wondering what was the logic behind it. Perhaps, as you said, there's a market of ideas, and here there's also a market of ideas within the report.
Sure. And so I think two reasons, really. One is there are a lot of ideas to discuss, and only 5 of us on the team. I don't have an agency. I've got 4 superheroes that work with me and write, but you know, even 4 superheroes plus me dragging them down can only do so much. And we really did want to have our sort of entry into the marketplace of ideas here cover as much as possible. And so one is sort of capacity constraints, but the second, I think, more substantive, kind of serious answer is, you know, we did not undertake the project with the goal of injecting the GAI view into the world. You know, again, there are 5 of us, and even among the 5, we disagree on sort of plenty of issues. So I don't take the view that the goal of the report is, you know, like an agency might do, right? It is to sort of project a more uniform approach sort of into the debate. It's an academic report, and you know, and as academics are wont to do, we have a diversity of views, and I view that as really as a feature. I don't think anyone can really come away from the 34 chapters saying, you know, they all take the same approach, or they all, you know, I've got authors who disagree with each other within the volume, right? That does make the editing task difficult. There's a lot of fights over but-see citations, you know, to cross-reference to each other. But really the goal was to cover as much of the modern debate as we could. And it takes a lot of authors to do that. And to the extent that they've got a diverse set of views, I view that as, yes, differentiating, but to me, I think, you know, a value add of the report more than anything else. I will say, to the extent that there was, you know, an editorial hand on the chapters, I view, you know, thematically, I certainly, you know, I have a hand in selecting the authors, no doubt, and inviting them. And, you know, I do think you will see sort of thematically the view that, you know, economic analysis is incredibly important to shedding light on the shape of substantive antitrust doctrine in our institutions, that empirical evidence matters a ton, that decisions made where the theory to data ratio is approaching infinity are ones we should approach with caution. I think thematically, I certainly tried to select authors that I thought were at least sympathetic to that view, even if they didn't hold it, so that the report would have some cohesion. But beyond the sort of minimal guardrails for that sort of cohesion, it was pick really smart people and give them topics and let them fly.
Joshua, speaking about debate, I want to press on a subject, and it's the fact that there's dissent within the report. Not everyone thinks the same. Could you mention a couple of examples of chapters that posit different opinions or contradictory examples? I don't know. Sure.
So it's a big, wide report, and so there are plenty of these. But I give a couple of examples. John Yoon in the section on multi-sided markets. So John and I, in published work and in his own work, have taken the view that the right way to think about digital markets, we've got the Amex case here, but the right way to think about doing both economic analysis and sort of setting burdens in cases involving multi-sided markets is essentially having the plaintiff bear the burden of proof of showing an overall detrimental effect to the market. That view, I've got 3 or 4 different authors who take a different view, that you have to put a narrower burden on the plaintiff in the prima facie case and align with have the defendant argue that there are benefits in some sort of other market. I think that second view is the standard view among US academics right now. John and I think, are the outliers. John, myself, and the Supreme Court, I think, are the outliers. But I've got several authors on that issue within the same chapter who disagree with that position. I think we've got plenty of authors who, I think we may talk about this later, but Bruce Kobayashi and I, in our piece on exemptions and immunities, take a particular view of state action immunity in the United States. I would say we've got our view is sort of born in Frank Easterbrook's work on antitrust federalism in the 1980s, but a relatively narrow view of state action immunity that would grant public restraint states immunities only when the effects of the restraint are wholly bound within a particular state. That view that state boards and local boards can only get or lose any such immunity if there's any spillover effects across state borders is certainly a minority view. We submitted a comment to the DOJ when they had a workshop on that issue, and I'm not sure if we got anybody to agree with us. But that one, we don't have the Supreme Court on our side, but we're trying. But that view, when we think about, I think, is certainly in tension with other views of state action immunity and public restraints expressed in the paper, both in Tom Lambert's work and Maureen Olhouse's work. There's a couple. We could do those all day if you want, but I think there are lots of those.
Great. Joshua, in your presentation, you mentioned that there's at least 2 unifying themes in the report, which are economic analysis and evidence-based policy recommendations, okay, I guess, or analysis as well. But I want to push a bit further, because any policy analysis involves, or any rigorous policy analysis involves both the economic bit of the analysis and offering evidence-based analysis. So, and I'm sure there's out there work that doesn't fall there, that doesn't take into account enough the economics, the microeconomics of digital economies, or maybe it's not sufficiently evidence-based, as you mentioned. But can I press you a bit more about what, rather than this form which I would expect from any rigorous policy analysis, what distinguishes these collective views from the 100 other reports in the substantive bit? For example, if you want to kind of comment about ex-ante interventions or specific matters that you would like to, I know that you have to speak on your, like for yourself, you're not speaking for the authors, but maybe you can give us some examples.
Sure. So let me say a couple of things. And if you're trying to get me to name names about which reports I think lack evidence or economics, I'm happy to play. But I'm not particularly shy.
That's not necessary. But I mean, but if one says that what distinguishes my work is these 2 features, one would say, well, maybe that's because there's many others that are not complying with that. I'm not sure, but
yeah. So I'll give some examples. So the House report that just came out in the U.S. that's over 500 pages and got a lot of attention. There are a lot of documents cited. They had subpoenas. They got documents. I didn't have any subpoenas. I wish I did. But they had, they cited a lot of documents. There's 2,000 footnotes and 500 pages, and the report calls for overturning 23 United States Supreme Court decisions, and even calls for overturning a law review article. I'm not sure how you do that, but mostly that's just me being jealous. No one's tried to overturn one of my articles in the Senate, and so one can dream. But that report, for example, I think ranks particularly low on the evidence-based, scoring scale, whatever we might call that. The theory or policy proposal to data ratio is especially high, I think, in that report. A lot of these reports have, well-credentialed, really smart economists I respect associated with them. I did a debate just the other day with Jason Furman, who was involved in the CMA report. He's a brilliant guy, and I think guided that report in the direction he saw fit and have his hands on it. And I certainly don't mean to say that there's not economic content in these reports. There are. But I think most economists, most microeconomists, if you gather them in a room, would say the sort of standard regulatory approach is substantiate a claim of market failure with evidence, then make the policy proposal, and show me that it does more good than harm. I think that's sort of law and economics 101. It is my general view, certainly not applied to every report and every proposal, that there are a lot of policy proposals flying around that really haven't been, you said you would like to see from any rigorous report that they meet those criteria. I don't think that they do. I don't think that they do for a lot of proposals, and there's some place they do. So, for example, there's a pretty serious discussion in some of the reports on the data on concentration. Right? There's been plenty, there are papers around, and you have economists discussing the papers. That's a place where, and I point to Jonathan Click's chapter, that's a place where, I think our contribution is not that we're adding rigor where others didn't have it. It's that we're interpreting the data and contributing by offering a different view on it. And that's sort of one bucket of things that's in the report. There are other places. Take, for example, a really popular policy proposal in the United States right now, two really popular proposals, and they're popular in other places too. One is to flip the burdens of proof in civil merger enforcement. Okay. Another is to create a digital regulator. There are any handful of reports that have said that this is a good idea. There's not any real serious analysis on either of those that I have seen about why doing so would do more harm than good. They're sort of policy level pitches, right? They're sort of elevator pitches for why you might want to adopt those ideas, and things you might tell a senator on the way to a meeting, sort of that level of analysis, but there's not been any real rigorous analysis of why that would do more harm than good. There are proposals in the United States about cementing merger presumptions. Now, I don't mean flipping the burden of proof, but I mean cementing the structural presumption. Usually this is made with claims that say something like, it's really hard to win merger cases in the United States. Goodness, there are efficiencies everywhere. Well, the government agencies win 85% of their challenge cases. Defendants have won a litigated merger challenge in the United States 3 times in the last decade. 3 times. The number of times, I won't turn this into a quiz for you. It's awkward to give a quiz on Zoom, but guess and keep to yourself, or the number of times a defendant in a Section 7 merger case has prevailed by showing that there are efficiencies that rebut the plaintiff's prima facie case. The answer is 1. It's arguably 1. In Timo Sprint recently. It is rare. People want to cement the structural presumption. We have a Supreme Court case that shifts the burden of proof upon a showing that the post-merger share is greater than 30%. We already have that. It's in Supreme Court doctrine. And it's one of the reasons why the plaintiff's win rate in civil merger cases in the United States is above 80%. It's not a world where plaintiffs don't win, right? More than that, right? So I was in a debate with Bill Baer a week ago. I only debate people who tell me I'm wrong. And I was in a debate with Bill Baer, and he said, yeah, plaintiffs don't win these cases. And it's not what the record says. Well, fine, Josh, maybe if they win the cases, it's just because all the government can do is win slam dunk cases because the law is set in the wrong place. A really good way to test that, if you wanted to do the analytics, is what happens when the agency announces it's going to challenge, but we don't actually go to court. What's the shadow of the law say, right? Well, what happens in those cases, there were eight in 2020, where the agency said they wanted to challenge. What do parties do who think that the law favors defendants? They run? Well, hard to write an economic model of that, right? But there's 8 where the party said, hey, we're going to sue you. And the party shut down shop and they walk away. It's hard to square that evidence with the evidence that the agencies are having a hard time winning cases because the law is not in the right place. I see Section 7 merger law, and I know this is a longer answer than you wanted, so I'll shut up quickly. I see Section 7 merger law where the plaintiffs already get a burden presumptive shift at 30%, where defendants once in the history of Section 7 have won on an efficiencies defense. And it's hard for me to understand where the crisis in Section 7 law is that requires stripping the ability of defendants to make defenses is. Judges aren't getting fooled by those defenses. If anything, plaintiffs are winning too many of those cases in my view. And I know that that's sort of heresy for the current debate, but I think the current debate should happen around the actual data of what's happening in those cases and why.
Joshua, I would like to hear about the intended audience for the report. For example, in a previous session, Philip Marsden told us, well, we didn't suggest specific things to specific agencies. We thought it would be better just to provide our general policies and policy proposals. And then I thought, well, what's the case with the GAI report? I mean, you have a global aspiration, that's part of your name. In the report, I see that you have both people from the US and some people from Europe. But I wonder whether your report is aimed more at the US rather than perhaps addressing Europe or even further jurisdictions that are interested in the topic.
It's a great question. And I think my short answer is everybody. And it really is with the 3 sections, it really is sort of three reports. The primer section is not jurisdiction specific. It is about concepts that are important to these issues, no matter what jurisdiction you are in. The empirical section is not just US data. And so I think that's sort of broader in nature. I think it is fair to say that the part 3, the policies and proposals section, sort of tends to be gravitate towards policies and proposals that have been offered in the United States. So it's got a little bit more of an US centric feel to it in part 3. But the short version is, unlike a government agency who has some constraints upon it, both for what it can write and not write, and who its audience is, and is not, no such constraints. And so, probably for a government agency, you wouldn't want to do something 1,300 pages because you would be sure nobody read it. I'm an academic. I'm used to nobody reading my stuff. It's fine. But our goal is to make, to make this parts of it attractive to academics. Part of it is regulators, both in the United States and abroad. It really is policymakers on the Hill. The average congressional staffer being asked to look at these burden flipping bills would have listened to my rant about Section 7 5 minutes ago and not known what any of the words meant. And so part of it is to educate. There are staffers in important positions in Congress in the US is being asked intensely to look at antitrust for the first time in a while, who are providing important advice. And I think, are in the market to be educated on these issues, and we would like to do it. So it's a little bit of everything. It's academics, it's policymakers, it's the competition community around the world, policymakers in the US. It's a great stocking stuffer for Christmas. It fit right in. It's fine. You just print it.
Joshua, thank you. There's questions from the audience, and Nicolas and Pablo, I think, have questions, so I'll end here for the moment.
Yeah, thank you,
so
Juan David. Yes, we do have some questions. Before we go to the questions, I've seen your comments on the House report, and obviously they've been very critical to the 450 something pages, and you already mentioned some of them. But we have one specific question by George Paul. He asked, I mean, what is going to happen under the Biden administration with that House report and monopolization cases? Will the US shift to the EU model, or see persistent dichotomy between a model of ex-ante regulation versus judicial enforcement? That's one question, and related mainly with the House report and the future of antitrust in the US with the new administration. We do also have some questions by Oles Andrichuk, which I think will go after this one, then Manuel Abarca, and we're also expecting Richard Wish and some other stellar people here to pose their questions. So what is your answer to the George Paul's question, Joshua?
Sure, and I'll try to keep my answers short because it sounds like you got a little bit of a queue. So I'll try to be brief, but thanks for the question, George. Here's what I think. The House report is full of some really ambitious proposals. I mean, it's literally every single Supreme Court antitrust decision since 1977, I think, except for one. I predict they do not overturn Frank Easterbrook's article. I think they will fail in that to get the Senate's attention on that one. But more seriously, look, so long as there is divided control of Congress and the Republicans keep the Senate, and we'll know soon. But I guess for my answer, presume that is true. I think for the House report proposals that have gotten the most attention, so flipping the burdens of proof in merger cases, messing around with potential competition doctrine, some of those. I think some of the more ambitious proposals are not likely to go anywhere with a Republican Senate. I think more likely what you're going to get, if there's any legislative action, are going to be things along the line of institutional reform. I guess everybody agrees the U.S. agencies should get more money, especially the U.S. agencies. So that's fine. You'll get that. I think you may see some tweaks to the Hart-Scott-Rodino system. So some of the critiques around missing nascent competition and killer acquisitions, I think you might see sort of broader notification provisions. I mostly think of these as tweaks around the margins, but not going to core substantive provisions. I think that's what you'll see. As far as the broader question of what happens with sort of Biden administration antitrust, we could do a whole another hour, but if there's not legislative change, I think it'll be interesting to see. I mean, if the chairman at the FTC is Rohit Chopra, and that's where I would bet my money, if we are under a regime of Chairman Chopra, he's to his credit, and this is he took the seat from me, so the dissents come with the seat. The commissioners change. Rohit's really open about what he wants to do. He's published papers saying competition rulemaking is coming, more consumer protection rulemaking is coming, and we're going to get the FTC out of the business on the consumer protection side of doing orders and order violations, and we're going to pass a bunch of rules so we can collect money in the first instance. I think you're going to see competition rules. You're going to see a shift of enforcement from ex post to an attempt to do ex-ante rulemaking. I think that's going to be a really interesting fight. It's not happened much in the US. US antitrust lawyers everywhere are finding their administrative law casebooks and trying to relearn administrative law because they're going to go see the DC Circuit a lot. It's going to make, for those who follow US regulation, I think the FTC is going to look a lot more like the FCC and the way that it conducts its business, sort of rulemaking and judicial review, which sort of isn't what we do in the sort of core merger review and the like. So I think a lot of that is coming. I don't think that's a mystery. I think Rohit in particular has told everybody where he's going to run the ball.
Thank you very much, Josh. We do also have a question by Hollis and then Richard Wish. Hollis, do you want to?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this fantastic format. I think it works perfectly because such a distinguished speaker wanting to ask question after me. So I'll try to be very concise. Joshua, my question concerns not the report. I mean, we live not exclusively in the digital world, but rather broader question about the future of the Chicago School. You can be, safely categorized as one of the protagonists of this, of this 5-10 years ago dominant discourse in competition law, economics, and policy. Today we see it's somehow been declining. Its universal metrics is being challenged from different angles. And one of the most appealing, not criticism, but shortcomings, it's precisely the claim to its universality. Now with all this kind of antitrust evangelism which we experienced over the last few decades, we see different jurisdictions applying competition law differently. Some do apply it opportunistically, some design regulation requiring pre-install 16 apps on the first page of the Google Play, etc., and presuming that the world that we still function in this kind of homogeneous world is very difficult. So my question, or assuming that Chicago School is primarily not about economics and consumer welfare, but it's primarily kind of hands-off approach, I wonder whether this ring of the plea to the government saying, look, it's the nature of the market will be tipped anyway, and our big tech is better than non-our big tech. Whether this kind of rhetoric will be, whether you predict this rhetoric being more, louder articulated. Thank you.
It's a lot of questions, and they're all good, and they're all good. And you're, gracious in describing me as having anything to do with the import of the Chicago School. I'm a UCLA guy. I've never touched the campus at Chicago, but I know where you're coming from, and I often am described that way. So fair enough. The direction of where I think some of that is going is, let me say a couple of things to be brief, and I'm not sure I'll touch everything you asked, but I'll try, and email me later if I don't, and we can talk. A couple of things. Going backwards, I do think you're seeing some of that sort of rhetoric being used now in the political discourse over antitrust standards. I think it's unfortunate, but you're seeing a lot of economic protectionism raised in the rhetoric on both sides. The side to get rid of the consumer welfare standard and the side who wants to keep it, right? And the side that wants to keep it, you're hearing rhetoric from politicians, and every time I get a chance, I try to say publicly that this is the wrong argument in favor of the consumer welfare standard. But, goodness, look at these other jurisdictions taxing U.S. companies. We don't want to adopt their standards because they are engaging in economic protectionism, et cetera, right? You're starting to see that rhetoric. I don't think it'll be effective at the end of the day. The reason is, the attacks being made, and this gets to the other part of your question, I think a lot of the attacks being made on the consumer welfare standard are attacks that were made before. There was a debate about the adoption of the consumer welfare standard in the Supreme Court. It was not a victory for conservatives. It was a bunch of 9-0 Supreme Court decisions with Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg joining. It was sort of not a right-wing conspiracy, as it's sometimes painted by US commenters. I don't mean by your question. And the context of that debate was people saying, well, let's have this more ambitious view of antitrust where we use it to achieve socioeconomic goals and participate, sort of, have it do more things, right? That debate was had in the United States and came out a particular direction, and we'll have the debate again, and maybe it'll come out differently. But my sense is if there is going to be victory for the, and this is sort of a positive statement now, not a normative one, but if there is going to be victory for the critics, it's not going to be in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court's had this debate and they're done. Those decisions are not 5-4, right? There's going to have to be success in the Congress. I don't think that is coming, mostly because our Congress doesn't agree on anything. But in particular, because I think when you have divided government, as we are likely to have, you are especially not going to get big sweeping changes through Congress to the antitrust system. So for better or worse, I happen to think better. I think we're stuck with the consumer welfare standard as is for a long time. I happen to think better precisely because the role of the consumer welfare standard, you sort of mentioned its malleability and ability to manipulate it for this end or that end. It's true of all standards. I mean, compared to what is the question I would ask? And a lot of the critics have said, well, let's have a general public interest standard. You want to talk about a malleable standard? Or we can go fully back the other way, which is, so like the open markets crowd in the United States has said, all right, well, forget the malleability and the public interest stuff. We don't trust the regulators. Let's have bright line rules. Let's bring back, this is their proposal, the 1968 horizontal merger guidelines, which declare unlawful any transaction above 10%. Okay? Now you still have malleability in the market definition game, right? You don't get rid of all of it, but I'll admit, like a much brighter line, I think you could line up 100 IO economists left, right, and center and ask them, is that a good idea for, that make people better off, whether you want to use welfare metrics or not, right? Most would say no. Now we can fight over other bright line rules, and I think that's where the fight is going, right? We'll have fights over whether we can have economically sensible bright line rules and do them through rulemaking and the like. But now we're out of the courts, we're out of Congress, and the question is, can you substantiate those sorts of rules? There might be a rule, Rohit has talked about, Commissioner Chopra has talked about a rule on banning or being restrictive on non-competes. I would support part of a rule like that. And so I think there are places where you can get some agreement. You want to ban all of them, I'm sort of off the train, as one example. So I think that's the direction the debate is going, but I don't think you're going to see a departure from the consumer welfare standard in court. I don't think that you're going to see a deviation from it or a shift away from it in Congress. And so I think you're going to have debates that look like traditional antitrust debates, which is, can we improve, can we sharpen the tools that we use in the existing antitrust toolkit to do better?
Thanks, Joshua. You mentioned the 1968 guideline, and that also reminds me to the conversation we had last week with Philip Marson and his report's intention also to be sort of something to be considered for the European Commission's new competition tool. And as far as I know, I think the new competition tool is taking looking to an old instrument on the UK investigations system. Maybe Richard Wish want to either comment or ask a question related to that, the new competition tool and the UK market investigation system, and if that was something that worked in the past or not, or any comments, Richard?
Well, yes, thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Joshua, for this presentation. I found it absolutely fascinating. I have to admit I haven't read your report yet because there are so many of them, but it's now much nearer to the top of my pile than it was, because there's obviously a huge amount of valuable stuff there. But early on in your presentation, you say you look at most of these reports, go to the debates on the subject, and normally we hear that there needs to be more intervention, and sometimes you hear maybe the Commission saying we've got to more vigorously enforce the antitrust rules, that's ex post enforcement, and there's also proposals floating around the place for ex-ante regulation, and it certainly looks as though Europe is going to propose that, and the UK is going that way as well. But then there's this third idea of the European Commission, which is to adopt a new competition tool. And this is a very sort of hybridized instrument where you say to an authority, you can look at markets to see if there are features of it that have an adverse effect on competition, in which case you can impose prospective remedies. Of course, there's no penalty for past behavior, there are no damages claims, but you do try to alter the shape of the market going forward. And it seems that on the 9th of December, the European Commission will propose that such a tool should be adopted. And it is based, as Pablo said, on the United Kingdom's Enterprise Act of 2002, which actually can be traced back to the Fair Trading Act of 1973, that does contain this particular weapon, and it has been used, and on some occasions it's been used to impose divestiture on undertakings. My question to you is, I haven't looked at the report yet, and so I don't know the answer to this. Is this new competition tool and the market investigation system something that you looked at? And if you did you form any views as to whether it was desirable or undesirable? It's certainly very controversial, and the conversations I've had with people in the States so far have been fairly universally hostile to the idea.
Thanks for the question, Richard. And I did not personally, in any of the chapters that I participated in, I was not personally analyzed a new competition tool. I certainly have followed the debate, and I don't want to run from the question just because I didn't write about it personally. So I'll tell you what I think anyway, since we're both here. And so, you know, I think part of I do have a chapter generally on ex-ante versus ex-post regulation in the trade-offs with Bruce Kobayashi, which is a subject we've written about in significant detail, including doctrine of implied immunity here, sort of conflict between federal regulatory regimes and the scope of antitrust in light of those conflicts. So it's an issue I follow and pay attention to. My general sense is that, and I'll make a general observation and then talk about the new competition tool. The general observation is I think that the debates in the US between ex-ante and ex-post take a weirdly, an oddly binary flavor, you know, do one or the other. And they sort of don't recognize the, as you call it, hybrid space. Our US antitrust laws have all sorts of features that involve some ex-ante. Well, we have HSR, which is about as ex-ante as you can get. We've got all sorts of features that I think have ex-ante components. And so one, the general observation, I think debates in the US sometimes reject an analysis of the trade-offs between the two because they pretend that the margin of analysis is zero versus one, versus, you know, sort of options in between on the spectrum. I do think that the desirability of ex-ante tools, including the new competition tool, I think are properly viewed through the lens of economic analysis, but whether we're going to further the objectives of the antitrust regime or not. What I worry about, and I think some of the hostility that you sense from, you know, Americans in this conversation, and even Americans who have views sort of that are far more interventionist than mine on these topics, is that a lot of the ex-ante proposals, think of proposals much more simple than, you know, intervention in digital markets, where I think as an empirical matter, we know a lot less. Presumptions for vertical mergers is a popular one here, right? You've had discussion over outright bans of vertical mergers for firms in digital markets. Right? That was proposed by Senator Warren, has some academic support, whatever. I'll use it as an example of an ex-ante regulation that's been proposed. And I think largely rejected in academic circles, left, right, and center in the United States, precisely because it is very difficult to square an ex-ante rule like that with an economic evidence-based approach to what we know about the competitive effects of vertical integration. The fight ranges, and I'm somewhere in this fight. I've written empirical papers on the competitive incidence of vertical integration. The debate ranges between mostly pro-competitive to a little bit less than mostly pro-competitive. The biggest critic of mine in this area is Fiona Scott Morton. She did a review of the papers. We disagree about 2 of 20 papers and how we characterize them. I say about 18 come out pro-competitive or competitively neutral. She says it's about 15. That's the margin we're fighting on. And to think about the competitive effects of a ban or you can lighten it from a ban to a presumption of illegality, but from an error cost sort of decision theoretic framework, it's really hard to come up with an economic justification for that sort of approach. And that's where we've got the data, right? These are mergers in beer and railroads and airlines and, you know, petro markets, right? We know a lot less. What we do know, and this gives me a chance to plug Avinash Kolas's chapter in our book again, what we do know is there's huge amounts of surplus created in these markets, right? And so, you know, this is not one of the areas where we get to have a fun debate over, you know, when guys like me say type 1 error, are we doing the Chicago school scare thing? No, there's actually billions of dollars of consumer surplus at risk in those markets. And the cost of both type 1 and type 2 errors are both probably pretty high. And so my view is, goodness, if you're gonna have an ex-ante rule, it ought be consistent with the goals of the ex-post approach, which are, at least here, to, you know, maximize economic welfare. And if we're gonna do that, what I've seen of the tools and the proposals around them, and I've probably read the proposals around the tool as deeply as you've read my report, but we'll both do better. You know, my sense is it is very difficult to square some of those ex-ante or even hybrid approaches with an approach that's consistent with the goals of the antitrust system. Certainly that's true in the US. I'll you know, leave the European system to others, but that is my sense, is that most of the ex-ante calls for ex-ante regulation, and I do not think that the new competition tool is an exception on this front. I'm happy to defend that line. I do not think are consistent in a sort of evidence-based direction with rules that promote rather than suppress economic welfare.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for your long answer. Thanks, Richard, for your question. I mean, we try to be very tight with the timing. We're trying to get it not more than an hour and 15 minutes. So we do have a lot of questions. I think we could stay for a couple of hours more maybe. But let me come back to Latin America. We have Manuel Abarca from Chile who has another question for Joshua. Manuel, you go ahead, please.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Joshua. My question is at the same time regarding Latin America. In Latin America, we don't have a strong digital competition policy. We most only have small and very local cases regarding digital topics, but we don't have a strong policy report, just like yours or all the available both in America and Europe. But at the same time, we don't have strong cases, or if you like, enough evidence of any conduct that can be investigated. In this regard, what would be your recommendation to Latin America? Is it better to make a strong report in order to determine potentially anti-competitive risks? To start a more aggressive enforcement regarding digital markets, something in between, something beyond? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question, Manuel. I'm going to give an answer that bores you, but is what I think is the truth, which is, by my lights, I think that the approach that competition agencies, you know, I'm a fan of the sort of case-by-case, roll up your sleeves and investigate individual markets approach, and not a big fan of the sort of broad sectoral inquiry that I think trades off sometimes, you know, sort of detailed understanding of the effects of particular transactions for the appeal of making sort of broader, sweeping generalizations. By my lights, you know, my view is the best thing that competition agencies can do is analyze specific conduct when there are complaints about the conduct or when they find it themselves, and subject it to the most rigorous analysis that their resources allow them to do. The agencies have to learn for themselves what the conduct is going, the effect of the conduct is in their market. As we know, in lots of places in unilateral conduct, the sort of core idea of difficulty with analyzing abuse of dominance or exclusionary conduct is conduct that looks the same can have different effects in different places. Exclusive dealing arrangements in one place may be pro-competitive, in another anti-competitive. And so I worry, and one of the reasons I worry about the sort of big, broad general reports is people point to them and they say, well, CMA said this conduct is bad. It might be bad in a particular time and place. But, I think for, all knowledge is local. And I think the best thing that agencies can do is to gain experience by getting their hands dirty in the markets that are in front of them and learning about them and bring cases where appropriate. Boring, I know, but it is what I think is correct.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Manuel. There's one question by Ian Forrester, the former judge of the General Court of Europe.
Hello, I have to leave, but so I would have loved to have stayed to the end of this. Thank you for hearing me out of order. In 2015, I was a mainly defense lawyer and a bit of a teacher and a bit of an article scribbler. And if I was told by one of my young colleagues that they were going to listen to or write, I would say, whoa, careful, wild man, and he'll corrupt you, and his opinions are much too radical, and this is dangerous stuff, but go and listen. He is very charming. And then I sort of stepped out of competition law because the court is a general court that does, I did a couple of competition cases, but not that many. And over the past few weeks, as the industry of conferences is getting revived, I've been attending competition conferences and listening to what people say. And it does seem to me that we are quite far away from the competition world that I left in 2015. And the fines that are imposed in the past 4 years totaled 20 billion euros. That's an astonishing sum of money. The burdens, for good or bad, imposed upon enterprises are astonishingly high. The system of judicial review is not that, I won't say rigorous, it's not that successful in addressing the big questions of whether particular conduct is or isn't valid in light of the basic principles of the Treaty of Rome as amended. And so I found this conversation just now fascinating because it is an invitation to go back to first principles from someone who is and has experience at the very top. There's very few people like that, I believe, in Europe at the moment. I'm quite surprised by how sharply I am uneasy as a result of my exposures over the past weeks to current theory and to this really excellent. It's not a, if you want to say something, I'll gladly listen, but it's hearing of a mumble from a former judge.
That is very, very kind of you, and I will just say thank you.
Very strange things going on. All right, must go. I'd love to stay to the end. This is a great discussion. I wouldn't say that Zoom has been justified by COVID or would make Zoom worthwhile. But this is one of the few unexpected benefits in speaking usefully and frankly and get a lot into an hour. I think it's great. ladies and gents, sorry, but I have to go. Really lovely, really, really interesting.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for the comment. Thanks, Josh, again for the short answer to Ian's comments. And again, thanks for the support to the, actually, that's the idea of the IDC, to discuss independently and to have dissents and respectfully discuss on our dissents. So, Nicolas, I don't know if you have any final words. I think we're reaching to the end of the time we have. Sorry, we have a lot of questions, but we cannot make them all.
No, thank you, Pablo. I only had a few more questions that maybe we can discuss later on another occasion. I just wanted to thank Joshua for joining us today and to thank everyone that joined us. I think that we had a great discussion. Maybe we can focus on some chapters later that maybe we can have more broad discussion. So thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you, everyone, soon. And thank you, Juan David, for joining the moderation of this. Hopefully, you will join us on further chapters. So thanks, Paulo, and thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joshua. Thanks to the audience. Thank you for being here.